This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm your host, Raihan Salam. The pandemic has had a profound impact on America's cities. The rise of remote work has changed commuting patterns, reducing demand for commercial real estate and foot traffic in urban cores. And thanks to large pension obligations, many cities can't afford to see their tax revenues decline. Some worry we may see some cities enter a doom loop, where all these problems feed into each other in a vicious cycle, progressively making things worse. My guest today is Arpit Gupta. Professor Gupta is an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and an associate professor of finance at New York University's Stern School of Business. He received his BS in mathematics and economics at the University of Chicago and his PhD in finance and economics from Columbia Business School. And he is one of the nation's leading experts on the changing real estate landscape and the threat of an urban doom loop.
We have trash bags lining the street, rats everywhere. Just sort of basic improvements in the quality of life, addressing those issues, addressing the scaffolds. We have hundreds of miles of scaffolding all across the city. These things sound minor, but they're reflective of an urban governance culture that has taken people for granted.
Arpit, you are someone I happen to know is a great lover of urban life. You are a big fan of New York City. You live in Lower Manhattan. You work in Lower Manhattan. It's been a big part of your adult life. And yet you've also been kind of someone who's been advancing a very dark, if not apocalyptic perspective on the state of the nation's downtowns. Last year, you published a study which spoke of an apocalypse for commercial real estate. I wonder, what exactly was it that you found so disheartening, both in New York City and also in urban cores nationwide?
Thanks for having me on. So the key motivating question for our study was to think about the impacts of remote work and what effects that's had on commercial office, on urban life more broadly. And the thing that caused us to be a little bit worried was the fact that office buildings are the cornerstone of urban life, right? Because they bring together commuters who are coming into the city and are sustaining an enormous amount of economic activity, both in the office as well as outside, if you think about the happy hours, the bars, the retail, the nightlife, and so forth. And so we were concerned that the loss in commuting volume that we've seen with higher remote work might be adversely affecting the values of these commercial office buildings, but then also more broadly, the fabric of urban life. And so our study, this is joint work with Staying with Neuberg and Brenda Mittal, sought to quantify the extent to which remote work has impacted cities. And we found that the amount of remote work we're seeing seems to be associated with firms being less likely to demand space. That's maybe not so surprising, but the magnitudes are really quite stark. And they sort of reflect the extent to which remote work has become a normalized aspect of our post-pandemic reality. And so our estimates suggest that cities like New York are experiencing something on the order of a 40% drop in the value of the commercial office buildings. And that suggests that this is going to be an important situation that cities and urban planners need to think about.
Just to be clear, has that been a durable effect? The COVID pandemic is to some degree in the rearview mirror. That was something that was a huge source of dislocation. But, broadly speaking, it seems that American life has returned to something like a pre-pandemic normal. When you look at tourism and what have you nationally, these things have rebounded. People are much more comfortable in congregate settings and the like. So has commercial real estate rebounded as well? Or do you see some differentiated pattern in which in some metros, say Sunbelt metros, it has largely recovered while it remains depressed in other places?
Right. So we thought a lot about both the uncertainty about coming back to the office as well as about the heterogeneous spatial impacts. And so we kind of explicitly upfront are acknowledging that uncertainty about whether or not people are coming back in. We sort of think of that as a new form of risk in the economy, some sort of work from home risk about whether or not people will come back. And we have also examined effects across the country. So there are certain metros, San Francisco most of all, which seems to have even more remote work and is therefore experiencing even larger impacts. And by contrast, it does seem like certain metropolitan areas are seeing a little bit more of a downtown revival. You can just sort of observe that by looking at what foot traffic seems to be like in certain cities, right? And areas like Raleigh or Salt Lake City are experiencing a lot more foot traffic, suggesting that urban life has kind of come back a little bit more. However, we still see the sort of basic pattern of rising office vacancies is sort of true in many cities across the country. So I think it reflects the durable nature of remote work's impact on the office.
So many cities, and this is an issue that you've been thinking about, you've been writing about and advocating on for some time, many cities have suffered from this huge lack of supply because of land use regulation. So is it possible that when you're looking at the so-called superstar cities, that actually it could be healthy for them to see some correction, some softening of demand because they're not willing to allow enough construction to accommodate what had been this incredible surfeit of demand? Why is it necessarily such a bad thing for that demand to decline to some degree?
So on the residential side, maybe that's okay, right? We're seeing, for example, that San Francisco is one of the very few cities across the country where rents are lower now than they were before the pandemic. And if you thought that San Francisco rents were too high before the pandemic, maybe you might think, okay, well, that's not such a bad situation. The problem is that we're seeing big shocks on the commercial side, the commercial office side, and there the dislocations are really showing up much more on quantities rather than prices. And what I mean by that is you're really just seeing that vacancy rates in San Francisco offices are, 30%, 35% by some measures, meaning there's just a lot of empty space. So no one's coming into that space at all. And the consequence of that kind of vacancy is going to be felt in terms of just much lower foot traffic. Fewer jobs are going to be possible because you're not serving as many people coming in. The transit system is affected because you have a much lower flow of commuters. And so it's not sort of a continuous, smooth adjustment. It's kind of jerky a little bit and kind of exposes cities to new threats if they're seeing sort of a persistent shortfall in demand.
You've often used the term urban doom loop, and I wonder if you could explain what an urban doom loop is in practice. How is commercial real estate driving these loops, and what impact do you see this this kind of step change in demand for commercial real estate having on basically the fiscal health of America's cities?
Great. So let's sort of step back a little bit and think about how cities have coped with other large dislocations in the past. So in fact, this period of deurbanization sort of arguably started with the streetcar suburbs, if not even earlier, but the biggest wave of deindustrialization that really hit the United States after World War II is a period that was really rough on cities. So what was kind of happening in that period, this sort of starting from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, is you saw a variety of technological innovations. So innovations like container shipping, the fax machine, and new investments in areas like highways, cars, which sort of moved a lot of economic activity outside of the very centers of cities into a broader range of suburban locations and to other parts of the country. So for a city like New York, that meant that we had about 1 million manufacturing jobs, many of which were very centrally located. And the majority of those manufacturing jobs left. And in a brief period in the 70s was the greatest amount of job loss. Now, that shock was really disruptive all across the country, but had very differing effects, right? So many cities, Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, lost 50, 60% of their population. And the basic dynamic that happened there, which I think falls under the broad urban doom loop category, is that you have this loss of jobs that then results in some amount of urban flight that then forces municipal local governments to either raise taxes or cut services in order to cope with the fiscal loss. Those fiscal adjustments then encourage other residents to leave, and the cycle sort of continues. And we've seen spirals occurring in some of those cities that resulted in pretty substantial population loss along with job loss. New York City was also pretty badly affected in this time period, but didn't have as much of a degree of job loss as some of those other cities, and certainly didn't have as much population loss because those were kind of made up for by gains in white-collar employment. And so New York City overall lost about 10% of its population that time period. It was still pretty rough. There still were a lot of big service cuts, and that was sort of the lowest point of the city in some ways. And ultimately, the city was able to sort of find its footing again around those new types of white-collar employment that are now the subject of the modern-day urban doom loop. So what we're suggesting with this idea is we're not predicting it's going to happen, but we're outlining it as a sort of conceptual framework to think about how might disruptive could these shocks resulting from remote work be to cities that are seeing a certain degree of job loss in the same way that they saw a few decades ago. Of course, it's different in this context because the jobs are not literally disappearing. It's just that people are doing those same tasks at home in New Jersey or Connecticut or wherever else they may happen to be, rather than coming into the office, and hence that has implications for the consumption multiplier that ordinarily was experienced when people physically came in and were spending their income on local services and so forth.
When you're talking about the post-war era, one way to think about that period of deurbanization is that, as you say, there were a number of technological innovations and complementary business model innovations that fostered a huge amount of decentralization. Part of that was public policy driven, but part of that was something that you saw across the world's market democracies. And remote work could be understood as a similar shock where there's a technological change that was there. COVID accelerates it. Okay, so you see this big move towards decentralization. But in your work, you've also pointed out the fact that things look very different in a San Francisco than in an Austin, Texas. Can you talk about that contrast? The same technological forces are working in both metropolitan areas, and yet it seems as though the cities have responded in markedly different ways.
Right. So I think that's a very complicated question. I think at a high level, you sort of have to think about there being huge complementarities with respect to in-person work, right? So it only makes sense to come in the office if other people are also there in the office. So that's sort of how you get multiple equilibria and how you sort of get these transitory shocks having very persistent long-run impacts in some areas potentially, but not others. It's sort of the extent to which the whole equilibrium of a firm or of a whole city kind of might change and result. And if you look at San Francisco, certainly you see that it has a lot of employers that have eagerly adopted remote work practices. So they are maybe responding to higher managerial quality, which is enabling them to monitor employees a little bit better. Big picture, I think that's also why there's more remote work in the U.S. Compared to Europe. One of many reasons is that there's high managerial quality in the United States, which makes it easier to sort of monitor workers remotely. So that means that you have the industrial mix, the firm mix that's kind of conducive to remote work, but kind of even controlling for that, it does seem like San Francisco has a little bit more remote work compared to other cities. And so there, I think you also have to think about the high housing costs. So the fact that people who are able to move out of the area are able to just really save a lot on housing or else get higher quality housing. The bundled housing they really want can be cheaper outside of San Francisco than inside of it. So facilitating those kinds of moves is a big deal. And then I think you also sort of need to think about the general law and order situation, the general issues around public safety that many cities are struggling with.
Interesting. So basically the same force is impacting many different places, but some mix of the mix of firms you have and whether or not they're capable of monitoring those workers, and also public policy. Public policy does seem to matter. Maybe everyone's going in this direction, but you can kind of slow down the shift to some degree by making sure that you're kind of protecting public safety and these amenities. So I wonder, you've talked about this idea of the consumption city. When you're talking about that, commuting downtown and what have you, you're talking about that kind of core idea. You used to have garment manufacturing and now you have office workers. But the consumption city model points us in a somewhat different direction. Talk to us about what that means.
Absolutely. So this is something that people had been discussing, of course, even before COVID. And, one basic observation people had made is that you see a lot of people that live in the centers of cities, but actually do a reverse commute. Right? They're commuting out to a suburban office building, even though they live in the center of the city where it's more expensive. And you can sort of rationalize those choices with the idea that they're really in the city in order to try to benefit from urban amenities broadly and consume them. So being able to go to restaurants, bars, the theater, and so on and so forth. So maybe that's going to be kind of the core anchor, keeping people in cities rather than the adjacency to work opportunities.
So I wonder, when you think about New York City in particular, where you're based, a place that you've thought about very deeply, what would the right policy mix be like? And I realize that you're not the czar, but if you were in a position to advise local and state leaders, are there certain things that you would think of as your highest priorities to ensure that we continue to make New York City an amenity-rich place that's going to be attractive to people who have the option to live elsewhere? Absolutely.
So I think high on my list would be livability concerns, and high in that category would be getting the trash off the streets, which is something I've written and thought a lot about. So it's a peculiarity of New York, of course, that we don't really have alleyways and so forth. And so we have, trash bags lining the street, rats everywhere. And so just sort of basic improvements in the quality of life, like addressing those issues, addressing the scaffolds. We have hundreds of miles of scaffolding all across the city. These things sound minor, but they're sort of reflective, I would say, of an urban governance culture that has taken people for granted and sort of thought that people don't really have any other choice. This is the best city in the world. These are the best jobs in the world. What else are people going to do? So now that we're seeing that people have a choice, you sort of want to approach the situation with an eye towards how can you attract residents and how can you keep residents once they're here. So those basic quality improvements, making cities more walkable, making cities more bikeable, that's something that improves the quality of life for people that live in the city relative maybe to people that are commuting into the city. So trying to make it more attractive for people that live here. Then I think another broad category of things has to do with sort of public safety, public order. So that's kind of a key consideration around ensuring that people kind of find it safe and livable to kind of live in these dense urban areas. Another area I think would be trying to basically assist families, because we've seen that many of the people that have left New York City are parents with children. I think we can kind of see that because the New York City school system is down about 90,000 children in the last few years. The average cost to educate a K through 12 public school child is about $37,000. That's the budget per child in New York City schools, which primarily reflects the decline in enrollment over the last few years and a fairly stable spending base. So I think you're seeing that families are voting with their feet and they're kind of responding to livability concerns, schooling concerns, public safety concerns, and of course, housing concerns. So that's another key area where we simply have too little housing. And this is commonly stated as we have too little affordable housing, but I think we really just have too little housing across the board. We have too few houses that are new and offer people the amenities that they're looking for that they can find in a Nashville or Miami. I think we have too few buildings that have multiple bedrooms that are really high in demand as families are thinking about where can they get a housing location that can sustain maybe multiple parents remote working. So we're just totally lacking the housing quality stock that is necessary to attract and keep people.
Arpit, you've anticipated a question that I've been thinking about quite a bit. It seems as though when you're looking at many urban cores, New York City foremost among them, you're seeing this unusual situation in which you haven't seen a full population recovery to the kind of pre-pandemic moment, and yet you're still seeing increases in rents. Those increases in rents are not necessarily as extreme as what you're seeing in this kind of outer exurban ring of cities that's become more attractive given the advent of remote work. But I wonder, what do you see as driving that? Is it, mostly because more affluent households are kind of bidding up prices because they want more room? What's the story there?
Right. So I think on some level, this increase in inflation here sort of reflects the increase in inflation that you're seeing in many different categories, right? So many families just have more money. They have more money because they've been saving over the pandemic. Maybe they've received some assistance from the government. Whatever their source may happen to be, there's increasing purchasing power in the economy, and that's sort of bidding up the prices of many different goods and services. And so rents are sort of no different in that regard. But I think there are specific issues in housing around remote work and space demand broadly. One clear way I think you can see that is that the increase in rents is really strongest for the 3-bedroom housing, 4 bedrooms, and so forth, really larger units that can accommodate families and can accommodate additional space necessary for people that might be using one of those rooms as a home office or a place to Zoom in or use Teams or whatever your platform of choice may happen to be. So I think remote work is having these housing demand effects. Now, it's also having very interesting effects because as it's shifting the population, people are kind of on balance moving to areas of the country where it is easier to build. And so you're actually seeing this supply response in other parts of the country that are increasing their housing stock in response to the demand from remote workers, but not as much here in New York City.
So there are some people who've argued that the so-called yes in my backyard, YIMBY enthusiasm for land use reform in New York City, the Bay Area, other high demand metros. Some say, hey, look, in a kind of post-COVID world, we don't have to be quite as concerned about that. What I'm hearing from you is the opposite, that was a good idea back then when demand was at its height. And it continues to be really important because actually people can afford to be choosier, and therefore they are going to have an appetite for more amenity-rich, newer housing, and that we're shooting ourselves in the foot by not trying to address that. Is that a fair characterization of your view?
I think that's right. And another way of sort of characterizing that shift in sort of bargaining power away towards people that are using space is to, just kind of think within real estate and think about the difference between a hotel property and an office property, right? So probably the last time that you or any of the listeners were in a hotel, right, you just notice that it's a hospitality industry. And so people are trying to attract you to their location. They're trying to make it very appealing. And, typically hotels have a whole, of course, star system, and you have really high quality hotel space that is intended for hospitality purpose. And historically, offices really haven't been like that, right? There's more a space that you go to and doesn't have the same consumer-facing hospitality culture. So another way of reframing all this is that offices kind of need to be a little bit more like hotels, right? And hotels probably are going to look a little bit more like offices and have people doing a little bit more work. And cities kind of also need to get a little bit of that culture and think about what are some ways they can kind of attract residents. And of course, it's possible to do so by offering additional amenities and services. And it's also possible to compete on price. And probably you want to do a mixture of both, trying to offer the best services at the lowest possible price point.
One dimension of urban governance is looking at taxes, the tax burden, and how it varies across different locales. One classic argument from defenders of the kind of high tax regime in New York and California and elsewhere has been that actually when you're looking at high-income households, they're not super tax sensitive because basically, you're relying on the economic agglomeration in a certain place. You have your professional network, but also your family network that's really embedded in a particular place. But I've always wondered about how that applies to younger people looking to start businesses, people who are at a point where they're weighing whether they want to grow a business in a certain place. Tell me about how you think about that, because, it does seem as though cities are now with smaller cohorts of younger people because of declining fertility, et cetera. There is a kind of war for young talent. So I'm curious how that interacts with these other developments you're describing.
So I've been sort of looking through the literature a little bit, trying to weigh the evidence on this point. And you'll find a few different studies here. So Josh Rao, for example, has some nice papers looking at the experiments in California with additional millionaire taxes. And, there are a range of elasticities there for how people respond with their migration choices with respect to increases in tax rates. One thing I've been looking for, I haven't quite found, is something that goes exactly to your point, which is my suspicion is that people are most sensitive to tax issues if they've already decided to move. So I take all those points that probably people are sticky in many ways in deciding where to live. But if I've made the choice that I am going to move or I'm considering moving, then probably the tax rate becomes a far more salient component of where I'm deciding to live. And I think other sort of broad evidence that's sort of consistent with this being at least one force is that New York State has actually seen a big decline in its share of the nation's millionaires over the last decade. Now, if you think that millionaires are bad, maybe you're sort of happy with the lower relative share. But I think it's at least consistent with the idea that the overall environment, that includes tax environment, includes the public services, the housing costs, and so on and so forth, is sort of leading to a world in which the next billionaire is deciding to go to a Texas or Florida rather than New York. And that can incorporate a lot of different margins, which are very complicated and hard to study, right? It can be someone that's deciding not to move to New York and start a business because they're weighing the after-tax benefits they might receive. It might reflect a young person that is a little bit more footloose, deciding where to relocate, or it could reflect people that are already millionaires and maybe they don't move every single year, but when they're deciding where to move to, they may be weighing different factors.
When you're thinking about New York City and other major cities in that kind of post-70s era during this period of urban renewal, one big ingredient was immigration. Immigration across the spectrum, both working class immigration and also the immigration of skilled workers, seem to play a very big role in revitalizing and densifying some urban communities. You've observed that there appears to be a change, that what had been the classic immigrant gateways might not have the same kind of magnetic attraction to newcomers today. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Right. So first of all, backing up to that earlier period, I think when we're talking about the deindustrialization, I think we should also keep in mind that it followed the period of sort of the large immigrant pause that sort of started from the 1920s period, right? So if you sort of follow that cohort, you'll see that it's a few decades later that these cities are sort of seeing deindustrialization and urban flight. And I think that in part reflects that you had this large wave of immigrants, many from Eastern Europe, that went to a lot of these industrial Rust Belt cities like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and so forth. And then as they're kind of considering moving again, that's sort of when those cities are sort of experiencing declines. And then we had the increase in immigration starting from the 1960s. And those immigrants, as you're pointing out, then kind of went and, to possibly a different mix of cities, but certainly provided important support base to a variety of the gateway cities in the United States in particular. I think what we're seeing in the last few years is a combination of different forces. So again, if we're thinking of urban populations, right, that's going to come from births, it's going to come from domestic migration, and it's going to come from international migration. And we've seen that domestic migration has really slowed after about 2015 or so. So the period immediately after the financial crisis, 2010 to 2015, was a temporary period of domestic migration into cities. So Americans themselves were moving into cities. So that started to reverse already by about 2015.
Sorry, can you tell us about why that was the case? So during that kind of post-2008 period, what is it that made cities so attractive in that moment?
So I think it was a combination of demand and supply. So the supply forces were that housing construction was really taking a hit all across the country. And so the new waves of homes that were being built in the Sun Belt and other areas, so housing construction kind of ground to a halt in those regions. So you're relatively more inclined to move to a city. And then there's all the demand forces. So in both demand forces in terms of jobs, so a lot of tech jobs, for example, happening in urban clusters, and then also some of these urban amenities, right, that are kind of popping up in these areas, making them more attractive. So that was a very temporary period. And that's sort of when Enrico Moretti sort of wrote his sort of book about American economic geography. And that was sort of the high watermark of that sort of urban moment. And after about 2015, we actually sort of saw that Americans sort of started to leave cities. And that's sort of reflecting the high housing costs and the other congestion burdens that kind of come with cities.
So you started to see a supply response in the Sunbelt cities that had been gun shy because of the housing bust. They started revving up housing construction again, and there was that pull factor.
Exactly. So there was the push factor out of large cities, which aren't building as much housing, and the pull factor from those Sunbelt areas that have started to build a little bit more housing, which was just amplified during the pandemic itself. So that's when we saw a much larger period of urban flight, which has been sustained to an extent. However, cities going back several decades have endured periods of domestic net migration outwards, and that's been sustained by two other forces, which are foreign immigrants and new births, both of which have been experiencing big shocks lately. So with respect to foreign immigration, we've not only seen declines in immigration in the last few years, coming with a big pause over the pandemic, but we've also seen that foreign immigrants are increasingly likely either to first head towards those same Sunbelt destinations that American migrants also want to move to, or they may spend just a few years in a gateway city, a city like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, before heading themselves towards the Sunbelt. So that just sort of means that the foreign immigrant mix is not as much of a long-term presence in cities as maybe it was in decades past. And then the last factor is just new births, fertility. Those have been on secular long-term declines.
With regard to immigrants, one argument you'll often hear is that when you're looking at newcomers in the very early stages of being in the United States, getting settled in the United States, oftentimes they are sending remittances back home. That's a big priority for them. And they're not necessarily as sensitive to housing quality because they've already, kind of made this big move to another place. So they will be focused on nominal incomes. And nominal incomes had been significantly higher in these gateway cities. Is part of what's happening now that those differences are flattening to some degree, and that some of these newer cities, Sunbelt cities, are offering higher wages to those kind of entry-level immigrant service workers?
So I have seen some evidence that those wages are flattening a little bit, and that reflects two things. One, it reflects the fact that in many cities, even till today, there are still gaps in certain categories of work, particularly leisure hospitality work, right? So if I am an immigrant working in the restaurant sector, right, there are still going to be gaps in employment in these sectors in the densest parts of cities. At the same time, what we're seeing is as people are spending more times in the suburbs and as they're moving to the suburbs, you're seeing endogenous amenities grow out in the suburban areas as well, right? They're basically becoming more lively, attractive places because people are spending more time there and have greater demand for other services. This in turn means that there is more demand for all types of labor. And so you're seeing a relative shift in the price of work, of wages in these areas. So what all of that ultimately means is that immigrants, I think, are increasingly responding to those economic incentives and moving out to where other Americans are also moving to.
You've talked about a number of shocks, including the globalization of manufacturing and more recently the ability of knowledge workers to work from home. There are a lot of folks who are thinking about the prospect of another significant shock, which is the rise of artificial intelligence and its many potential applications to knowledge work. I wonder if you could talk us through how that might affect America's urban geography. So, with remote work, you've talked about how, those technologies have been around, but you've seen a lot of business model innovation around it. But, when you look to AI, could that be something that drives a new urban renaissance? Because, let's say it makes the kind of in-person services that cities offer that much more important?
So this, of course, more speculative than the other parts.
Of
where
course.
I have done some research, but I've certainly seen a lot of research that suggests that these new generative artificial intelligence tools appear to have large productivity enhancing benefits. So that's the case, it seems like, for coders, for accountants, for a large category of white-collar work, that if you can use some sort of AI assistant, you're just going to be dramatically more productive as you do your work. I think that ultimately has both negative and positive consequences for employment, as we've seen from other ways of automation in the past. So I think what will likely happen if it follows similar trajectories compared to prior innovation is that it will disrupt or displace certain tasks or certain categories of work while creating new tasks and new categories of work. And the question for urbanists, I think, is the geography of where those tasks get destroyed and where the new jobs are created. So I could imagine a world in which existing white-collar work is really badly disrupted, because if you're a financial analyst, if you're a coder, if you're a call center worker, you can actually amplify your productivity substantially by using these AI tools in ways that reduce demand for total labor in these categories. So I can imagine that having negative consequences for total employment in a lot of areas that are already fairly urban, while the gap between that and the new jobs that are created might be substantial. So it may take more time to generate those new jobs in other categories. It could be that those new jobs are located in different geographic regions compared to areas that are experiencing dislocation, or they may be more amenable to remote work. It's hard to sort of forecast what's going to happen, but it wouldn't surprise me if there is some difference in the urban centrality of the old jobs compared to the new jobs in ways that might have consequences for cities.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that the job destruction that has an urban skew may well outpace the job creation that also has an urban skew, at least on some near-term time horizon.
It's possible, but of course we haven't yet seen what these tools are capable of.
Many American cities have responded to housing price pressures, that are to some degree a product of the supply constraints that you've discussed, by imposing new, more stringent rent regulations. That's certainly a big conversation, not just here in the United States, but also in cities around the world. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about, what you've gleaned from the academic literature on rent regulation and its consequences. Here in New York State, for example, there's been a big push for so-called good cause eviction, which basically entails what you might call universal rent regulation. I wonder if you could share some thoughts on that.
Sure. So I know there's been some work by Boaz Abramson, who's a professor at Columbia, and he's investigated not exactly this situation, but right to counsel policies. And that's in the context of a model where what he basically finds is that these types of right to counsel policies sort of are not very effective in reducing eviction and homelessness rates, at least compared to other alternatives, which include subsidies for tenants. And sort of the underlying reason for that is that many tenants that are experiencing eviction or the prospect of eviction are sort of facing persistent income losses. And so if you just sort of increase the regulatory burdens around that by, for example, a right to counsel policy, you may just sort of drag that process out a little bit further without necessarily resolving the sort of fundamental issues that a tenant is sort of coping with.
So you have been thinking quite a bit about urban commercial real estate recently, but also you are someone who's doing a lot of scholarly work on real estate writ large, and in particular, the intersection between real estate and recent monetary policy in the United States. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the interaction between monetary policy and America's economic geography.
Sure. So one sort of starting observation is that we've had several rounds now of quantitative easing in which the Federal Reserve has bought trillions of dollars worth of mortgage bonds. Now, these interventions, let's say they make sense in times of crises when these mortgage markets are not functioning very well. But one thing that we saw over the pandemic is the Federal Reserve actually bought trillions of dollars worth of mortgage bonds. And again, maybe you think that makes sense in March of 2020, but these purchases really continued not only to 2020, but 2021, well into a time period that we were actually already starting to see a little bit of inflation. And what that sort of had the effect of was to a certain extent of lowering interest rates, and by reducing the cost of credit, increasing house prices at the time when housing markets were already sort of overheating due to, in part, these remote work trends we've been talking about. And whether you think that's the fault of monetary policy or just these broader shifts happening in the economy, what that left us with is a world in which essentially a large number of homeowners have refinanced their mortgages or gotten new mortgages, either way they're locked in at fixed interest rates that are very, very low, right? They may be at a 2-handle interest rate, right? So their interest rate starts with a 2. And these borrowers are now looking at a new mortgage market in which prevailing mortgage rates are more like a 6-handle, right? And so it really doesn't make a lot of sense to get a new mortgage in such an environment. And so you're seeing basically very low housing inventory. You're seeing very low turnover. You're seeing very little inclination on the part of that subset of homeowners that have locked in a very low interest rate to move. Now, other countries actually have different mortgage products that allow for something called portability. So you can actually take your mortgage with you if you move property. So I might be less concerned about prevailing interest rates in that world, but under our mortgage system, you're basically dealing with a lot of locked-in homeowners that are not going to be very inclined to sell their home or move anytime soon, and that's just going to keep housing markets tight for the foreseeable future, I think, until the Fed potentially lowers rates down to equivalent levels.
Arpit, could you tell us a bit more about this portability approach? My understanding is that the Danish mortgage market does facilitate that kind of mobility, but for those of us who are not as familiar, could you tell us a little bit about the mechanics of that?
Sure. So this is an option actually found in many countries. So Canada, UK, Australia, and Denmark all have some version of it. It's found more commonly, as I understand it, in countries that have higher prepayment penalties. So basically the trade-off that we have here in the United States is that you can refinance or sell your mortgage, sell your property and pay off your mortgage at any time without penalty for most, government-insured mortgage products. But the flip side is when you have your mortgage, you can't take it with you. So if you want a new property, you'll sell the old property, you'll pay off the mortgage, again, without penalty, and then get a new mortgage on a separate property. By contrast, these other countries that actually have less of a federal government oversight into the mortgage markets, they don't have as much of that prepayment option given to people. So you're going to pay a little bit more for the ability to refinance or sell your property. And so they offer you instead an option to keep that same mortgage and just hold on to it and just move that mortgage with you to a separate property. So that is something that no one really thought about very much before, but actually kind of means that these countries potentially are able to unlock more moves than we're seeing in the United States.
That's fascinating because I suppose one finding is that immigrants are oftentimes more mobile in response to an economic shock, partly because they've already made one, kind of big migration decision. So, when you're talking about this lock-in effect, is it fair to say that you see that lock-in effect as something that might retard economic progress?
I think it's certainly a concern, and there's already starting to be some economic literature on the effects of this lock-in on migration mobility rates. And so if you thought that labor market mobility is one of the ways that we kind of achieve labor market equilibrium, then having a lower migration rate, could potentially hurt the process of labor market reallocation. Now, right now, maybe that's not as pressing of a concern, given that unemployment rates are sort of fairly low. But if we have further economic downturns, or if we start to see job losses in certain sectors in certain regions of the country, then you think that the optimal process for coming back to a new equilibrium might involve some people moving. And it's going to be hard for that to happen if people are just locked into their existing mortgages.
Arpit, you have done a lot of work on remote work, what it means, how firms are responding to the availability of these tools, and the greater cultural openness to the use of these tools. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you found when you've spoken to startup founders and what have you? Because you know that there's a kind of contrarian argument here, which is that actually remote work is quite bad. If you want to run a kind of really high-performing organization, you want face-to-face interaction. So I'm curious about what you've learned when you've spoken to people, who want to build successful businesses.
Sure. So first of all, my biases are that I like to come to the office every day. And so I certainly began this research with the sort of personal sense of, well, aren't you losing something in your culture, in your organization, if you don't have everyone being able to kind of collaborate together and so forth? And I think that's still fair. I think there are trade-offs and possible downsides with remote work. But I have heard two main things when I talk to startups and companies that are at a very small scale and thinking about remote work. The first thing they'll tell me is they sort of now view commercial leases as dilutive to the founder's own equity. So if you're a startup founder, you're very focused on your new sources of financing and how that affects your own financial position, right? Because if I take more equity, that's diluting and lowering my own equity stake in the business. If I take more debt, that's also similarly worsening the economics for my own position. Now, it turns out that this whole time, firms were also spending 15, 20%, let's say, of their overall expenses, if you're a typical white-collar firm, on the office building. And you may have just thought of that as a necessary operating expense, but you're now looking at that statement and you're now realizing, well, that's money that's coming directly from my profits as a founder, or it's directly competing with my ability to survive because I can actually extend my runway so much further if I don't have to make that payment. So essentially for financially constrained firms, the ability to just save a lot of money by not having an office space or having less office space is actually enormous.
So even if it represents a sacrifice of productivity to some degree, you'd need that sacrifice to outweigh the dilutive effect you're describing.
Exactly. And I think that's something that research in this area hasn't really addressed, because sort of the null hypothesis here for a lot of research is, does remote work affect productivity or does it not affect productivity, right? That's kind of presuming that a null hypothesis of zero productivity impacts is the right one. Whereas I would argue from a firm's perspective, especially startup's perspective, the right null is almost, do I gain 15 to 20% more in productivity by going to the office? Because that's the counterfactual. The counterfactual is getting rid of an office space, spending that much less. So the drop in productivity you experience has to be of that order of magnitude in order for being in an office to be worth it. And the other thing I think you have to keep in mind, especially when reading a lot of this research, is that, people are looking a lot at what firms did in 2020 when they were all forced to move into this new technology, right? And so that's the kind of second big thing I kind of gained from these firms is they're experiencing it not as a one-time shock that they just kind of shifted to. They're really thinking about what sorts of investments can we make and how can we re-engineer and optimize our processes in order to make remote work a better functioning reality, because we get all these benefits, not just the savings in office buildings. It's being able to really scale and have a national, if not global workforce, right? Being able to match with the best labor anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. That advantage is enormous, particularly for startups and small companies, where to find the right person and the right fit, well, what if that person isn't in your same geographic area, right? So being able to optimize around that and therefore figure out what do you have to do, therefore, to your culture, to your organization, to your processes in order to facilitate that superior labor match. And so I think what you're going to see in the coming years is these startups, these small companies, I think are figuring out very different solutions and tools that large companies have come up with. And in the long run, if you think that employment growth is increasingly going to be dominated by these small, high growth startups, I think that's going to affect more and more of the economy.
Interesting. So talk to me about some of these process changes. Is part of it that knowledge that had been tacit knowledge now has to become more explicit?
I think that's a big part of it. So if you're thinking about a firm in which decisions were formally made sitting around a table in a conference, in which information was kind of passed at the water cooler informally through these tacit means, if people just have certain types of knowledge, you just have to go up to them and ask them about it. There are benefits of this type of communication. So you can always find someone, someone who has the information, and you can preserve a little bit of privacy and secrecy, let's say, by keeping information within closed doors. But the downsides of this sort of oral tradition of making decisions include the fact that it's not very scalable. You have to kind of add more people one by one to the organization and have them just sort of talk to other people. And also, it's not really legible. You don't really know why your company has made a decision. It's just somewhere in the folklore of the institution. And so I think you're seeing a lot of very high performing companies think about an experiment with different ways of doing things that are more written down and more verbal. So examples here, I think, include Amazon that have memos sent around during the meeting, right? So instead of a verbal presentation, you're going to write down a document. People are going to read the document. That's going to be an archived source within the company that people can come back to. And that's going to be a common reference point. Or you have companies like Stripe, which has also invested heavily into trying to have a more verbal culture within the organization.
That's really fascinating. So essentially, looking at all of these forces you've been talking about today, it seems as though one takeaway for cities is that we're just in a much, much more competitive landscape, that the premium, that the advantage that some so-called superstar cities once had has to some degree eroded. That doesn't necessarily mean that all hope is lost, but it means that you're in a different kind of playing field. So I suppose you could look at two potential paths for cities. One path would be just across the board. You need to become more competitive when it comes to taxes, the cost of living, et cetera, pretty much wherever you are. But I suppose another path could be, maybe what you want to do is differentiate. Maybe what you want to do is build on your distinctive strengths. Can you talk to us about, how you would think about that, how you would counsel civic leaders to kind of think about the strategy for their region in this more competitive world?
So I think the first set of points, seem fairly general, right? All cities could probably benefit from better schools, cheaper housing, and a variety of different improvements that are fairly agnostic to the city's own strengths and weaknesses, right? That are just about improving the livability for everybody. But I think your second point is also right, that there is something about trying to think about who would move to my city that they're going to get something here that they can't get anywhere else, right? So that's, the same way that if you're a firm, you're sort of trying to differentiate your products, you're thinking on the one hand, how to just sort of provide a better experience that might be improved for all customers, but you're also trying to segment the customer base, and you're sort of trying to figure out what is the customer that can get a better experience with you compared to anyone else. And I think what that sort of means is going to vary, of course, city by city, but I think there is definitely something to figuring out how to lean in on your comparative advantage.
So, for example, let's say that most Americans would prefer kind of low density living, to live in a kind of, unattached single family home, but there's some large number of people who really want walkable urbanism. If you're a city that has some of that or kind of can get there, maybe the answer is, you're not going to be a majority taste, but you can really lean into that and just kind of pursue that so that footloose workers actually want to go there because that's where they can best match their preferences.
Exactly. So I see this all the time here in New York City and in Manhattan because, one common trope outside of the city is, we don't want to Manhattanize our little community, right? And what's frustrating to me is you actually hear the same sentiment in Manhattan. So you'll have people here in this city that oppose, taller buildings. And that just blows my mind because you live in Manhattan and yet you're opposing, a new tall building, or you're really pushing for more street parking in a borough that has, the lowest rate of street parking of any city in the country, right? So I think that's a perfect example where you sort of really need to think about what is the key strength and core attribute of your city, and think about, well, how easy is it for people to get this somewhere else? Because the reality is if you do want to live in a detached home and have a car and drive everywhere, Manhattan probably is not the place for you, right? There are places within the New York City metropolitan area which might be for you, but probably Manhattan is not it. And so trying to cater Manhattan towards the desires of people that do want to live that lifestyle kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because there's so many other places where they can get that better. But if you want to live in a large, dense city that has some of the best amenities in the world, that has great transit and so on and so forth, this is a pretty good city. So let's double down on trying to cater to those people that are looking for that experience.
Interesting. So play to your strengths. Arpit, thank you very much for joining us. You've made such enormous contributions to the literature on this urban doom loop, to the future of our cities, and we're just hugely grateful to have you on Manhattan Insights.
Thanks so much for having me.
Listeners, don't forget to check out his work for the Manhattan Institute. We'll link to a scholar page in the podcast description. If you like what you heard on the podcast, please feel free to write a review wherever you listen, and be sure to tune in to future episodes of Manhattan Insights. I'm your host, Raihan Salam.